Imagine you're holding a stopwatch. Tick every 60 seconds. Roughly $19 million worth of goods slides through a narrow ribbon of water carved into the Egyptian desert. Your phone, your car's transmission, that cheap kitchen appliance you ordered at 2 a.m. It's all moving through a 120-mile corridor that shouldn't matter as much as it does, but does. The Suez Canal is not just infrastructure. It is a vein. Roughly 12% of global trade passes through it. Oil from the Gulf, containers from Shanghai, wheat from Ukraine. Europe depends on it. Asia depends on it. Africa depends on it. And for one unforgettable week in March 2021, the entire world was reminded how fragile that dependency is. Ever Given decided to wedge itself sideways in a sandstorm, and suddenly global trade looked like a slapstick comedy routine. Memes flooded the internet. Satellite images turned a cargo ship into a cultural icon. But while the world stared at the water, Egypt was staring at the sand, because the canal itself, the toll booth, was never the end game. The real gamble is what surrounds it. The Suez Canal Economic Zone, known as the SE Zone, is a 460 square kilometer experiment, roughly two-thirds the size of Singapore. A bold attempt to transform Egypt from a landlord collecting rent into an industrial nerve center linking 3 continents. Chinese industrial parks, a Russian manufacturing enclave, green hydrogen megaprojects, billions in Gulf-backed financing, all layered onto an economy facing currency pressure, rising debt, and a population of over 110 million people demanding jobs, stability, and dollars. This is not just an infrastructure project. It is a national survival strategy. The question is simple. Is Egypt building the next global logistics superpower? Or is this a $300 billion field of dreams bet in one of the most volatile neighborhoods on Earth? To answer that, we need to understand the math. Because in the end, geopolitics is just arithmetic with consequences. To understand the SE Zone, you have to understand the Egyptian balance sheet. Egypt has more than 110 million citizens. That's not just a statistic, that's 110 million meals per day, jobs per year, imports per quarter. The scale alone turns economic missteps into existential threats. For decades, Egypt relied on 3 primary sources of hard currency. Those precious US dollars needed to buy wheat, fuel, medicine, and machinery. Tourism, remittances from Egyptians working abroad, and the Suez Canal. The canal has been Egypt's golden goose since 1869, a maritime toll road connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. Ships pass through, pay a fee, sometimes up to $700,000 per vessel, and continue their journey. In fiscal year 2022-2023, canal revenues hit a record $9.4 billion. That sounds impressive, until you place it next to Egypt's external debt, hovering north of $160 billion. $9 billion in revenue can evaporate quickly when interest payments alone consume vast portions of national income. Egypt realized something uncomfortable. Owning the road is profitable, but owning the highway gas station, the rest stop, the logistics hub, that's where the margins multiply. This is what economists sometimes call the renter trap. If you only collect tolls, you miss the industrial value chain. And in a world where trade routes are being reshaped by sanctions, tariffs, and regional blocs, toll booths are not enough. So in 2014-2015, President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi did something dramatic. Egypt expanded the canal, a parallel channel allowing two-way traffic. Experts predicted 3 to 5 years of work. The government demanded 1. It was completed in 12 months. Funded largely by domestic investment certificates purchased by Egyptian citizens yielding 12% interest. A moment of national pride. But economists raised an eyebrow. Wider canals don't automatically mean more ships. And more ships don't automatically mean more revenue unless global trade itself expands. The canal expansion was plumbing. The SE Zone was the house. It's formally established around 2015. The SE Zone was designed as a semi-autonomous industrial ecosystem. 6 maritime ports, 4 industrial areas, special regulatory authority. And here is the clever and revealing part. Egypt didn't just offer tax incentives, it created a bubble. Under amended legislation, the SE Zone operates as a one-stop shop. Its own board, its own customs mechanisms. streamlined regulations, special tax structures, 50-year land use rights. Why? Because Egyptian bureaucracy is legendary. There is an old Cairo joke. If you want to open a lemonade stand, you need permits from 5 ministries and a notarized signature from someone's grandmother. Global capital does not wait for stamps, so Egypt carved out an enclave where paperwork moves faster than politics. Zero customs duties on production inputs. VAT exemptions for exports. Duty-free access to trade blocs like the European Union through EU agreements. African markets through continental trade pacts, and Arab markets via GAFTA. Imagine you're a Chinese manufacturer facing tariffs in Europe. You relocate part of your assembly process to Sakna inside the SC zone. You import components, assemble them locally, meet origin rules, and suddenly your product enters Europe, tariff-free, labeled Made in Egypt. It's not just logistics, strategic positioning. But here is where the tone shifts. The SC zone sits in a region described politely as complex. To the east lies the Sinai Peninsula, long troubled by insurgency and counter-terror operations. To the south, the Red Sea recently disrupted by regional instability and maritime threats. You cannot legislate geography. You cannot decree stability. So, the question lingers beneath the promotional brochures. Can a bubble of efficiency survive if the neighborhood catches fire? And this is where the heavyweights enter the ring. Because Egypt is not building this alone. China has already unpacked its suitcases. Russia is trying to carve out space. And Europe is eyeing the horizon for green energy solutions. In the next section, we step into a slice of desert where Mandarin signs rise from the sand. Where Beijing isn't just investing, it's embedding itself in the artery of global trade. If you want to see the future of global trade, don't look at stock charts. Look at a patch of sand near Ain Sakna, where the street signs are written in Mandarin. Welcome to TEDA, the Tianjin Economic Technological Development Area, a Chinese industrial zone transplanted, almost like a geopolitical organ donation, onto the Red Sea coast. This is not a single factory, it's a system. A miniature version of China's manufacturing ecosystem. Warehouses, power infrastructure, training centers, supplier networks placed beside the Suez Canal like a chess piece on the most valuable square on the board. And the reason China is here can be summarized in one phrase that sounds boring, but rules the modern world. Certificate of origin. That's the real weapon. Because trade wars rarely target ships, they target labels. If a Chinese company exports directly from Shanghai to Europe, it might get hammered by anti-dumping measures, special duties, national security restrictions, or political backlash that has nothing to do with the product and everything to do with the flag on the box. But if that same company does the final stage of manufacturing inside Egypt, suddenly the box says, Made in Egypt. And the world's tariff walls begin to look like doors. This is why TEDA matters. The SC zone isn't just trying to capture passing trade, it's offering a loophole with ports. A legal backdoor into markets that are trying loudly to reduce dependence on Chinese supply chains, while quietly continuing to buy the same goods, just rerouted through friendlier paperwork. The most important part of this story is that it's already working. Take Jushi Egypt, a Chinese fiberglass giant. Most people will never hear its name, but they live inside its products. Fiberglass is in your bathtub, your insulation, your boats, your wind turbine blades, your building materials. It's one of those invisible industrial staples that makes modern life possible. Jushi built a massive plant inside the SC zone. And now, Egypt, a country not usually associated with advanced industrial exports, became one of the world's largest fiberglass producers, with most of that output shipped abroad. Not to the Middle East, to the planet. The factory's logic is brutal. Import inputs, process at scale, export almost everything. The zone becomes a machine designed to convert geographic location into dollar revenue. And when you scale that across hundreds of firms, appliances, cables, textiles, petrochemicals, light manufacturing, the zone starts to look less like a park and more like a strategic rerouting of global supply chains. This is the model Egypt is selling. We are the hinge. Asia manufactures, Europe consumes. Africa grows. The Gulf finances, Egypt sits in between. And the canal is the artery that makes the hinge profitable. But here's the reality that the glossy brochures don't show you. Every industrial zone has two economies, The official economy, contracts, incentives, one-stop shops. The human economy, labor, trust, friction, and the invisible cultural war inside every factory floor. In TEDA, you have a collision of rhythms. Chinese management culture tends to move fast, rigidly, often in a "we will finish this by tomorrow" mindset. Egyptian administrative culture is not that. The zone was designed to bypass Cairo's slow machinery, but it can't fully escape the DNA of the country it sits within. Wage disputes, training gaps, local procurement issues, they don't stop at the border of a special economic zone. So China's investment is both a lifeline and a lever. A steelman argument says China is helping Egypt industrialize, infrastructure, jobs, skills transfer, export capacity. A darker reading says China is building dependency, embedding itself into the canal's orbit so deeply that even if Egypt's politics change, the supply chain remains Chinese. Both can be true. That's the nature of power. But China isn't alone in this sandbox. Because while China is trying to build, Russia is trying to escape. Enter the Russian Industrial Zone, a project signed in 2018 with visions of a massive manufacturing hub. On paper, a 50-year lease, millions of square meters, factories exporting to Africa and the Middle East. Then 2022 happened. Sanctions hit Moscow like a storm. And suddenly, the Russian zone shifted from expansion plan to life raft. Because the SC zone offers something priceless to a sanctioned economy, relabeling capacity. If a product can meet local value-added thresholds, assemble, process, finish, it gains a new identity. A Russian tractor assembled in port, said with Egyptian labor, becomes Egyptian on paper, even if its heart remains Russian steel. This isn't conspiracy. It's how trade law works. And in an era where sanctions are the primary weapon of economic warfare, zones like this become laundromats for legitimacy. Now, here's the twist. The Chinese zone is humming because Beijing has money, momentum, and a long-time horizon. The Russian zone has been slower, more fragile, because sanctions don't just block exports, they block financing. They block payment rails. They make even basic transactions feel like smuggling. So for years, the Russian zone became a ghost story. Construction starts soon, 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 and when it finally begins to materialize, it reveals the deeper truth. This is not just Egypt attracting investment. This is Egypt becoming a platform for the great powers' workarounds. China uses it to bypass tariffs. Russia uses it to bypass sanctions. Europe uses it potentially to buy green energy without depending on hostile pipelines. Which brings us to the next mechanism. Because Egypt is not just betting on cheap labor and ports, it's betting on a product the future might demand: green hydrogen. And the SC zone wants to become the gas station of the next energy era. But hydrogen has a cruel sense of humor. To make it, Egypt needs the one thing it's always fighting over: water. In the next section, we move from factories and flags to the energy dream, the one that could turn Egypt into a clean fuel powerhouse, or the owner of the world's most expensive unfinished project. Let's cleanse the geopolitical air for a moment. We've talked about Chinese factories and Russian workaround zones. Now we enter the future-facing narrative, the one that sounds like it was written by consultants in Brussels and energy ministers in Berlin. Green hydrogen. If oil was the fuel of the 20th century, hydrogen is trying to audition for the 21st. And for Europe, especially after 2022, energy stopped being an economic issue and became a survival issue. When Russian gas pipelines became political liabilities, Europe scrambled for alternatives. LNG from the U.S. floods of renewable investment, nuclear reconsiderations, and a search for neighbors who could produce clean fuel at scale. Egypt looked at this chaos and saw an opportunity. Because geography had once again handed it a card. The Gulf of Suez is one of the windiest corridors in the world. The Egyptian desert has sunlight that feels less like warmth and more like an accusation. Wind plus sun equals electricity. Electricity plus desalinated water equals hydrogen. Hydrogen converted into ammonia equals something that can be shipped. And suddenly, the SC zone is not just an industrial backdoor. It's a potential energy bridge between Africa and Europe. Several memorandums of understanding, dozens of billions of dollars on paper, began circulating. Investors, sovereign funds. And multinational energy companies expressed interest in building electrolysis plants near Ain Sakna. But a memorandum of understanding is not a contract. It's the corporate equivalent of "let's stay in touch." Still, some projects have moved from slide decks to steel. A pilot green hydrogen facility has begun partial production. Egypt even executed a landmark green methanol bunkering operation, fueling a ship with cleaner alternative fuel instead of heavy fuel oil. This is not symbolic. It's strategic, because 12% of global trade passes through the Suez Canal. If environmental regulations tighten, and they will, ships may be forced to use cleaner fuels. And if Egypt becomes the primary bunkering hub for green fuel along that corridor, it captures not just toll fees, but the next layer of value. Ships won't just pass through. They will stop. Refuel, spend, anchor capital to Egyptian soil. But here's the paradox. Green hydrogen production requires enormous amounts of water. Egypt is already engaged in tense negotiations with Ethiopia over Nile water flows due to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Water scarcity is not hypothetical, it is political. So to produce hydrogen, Egypt must build large-scale desalination plants to convert seawater into usable input. That means more energy, more infrastructure, more capital. Hydrogen becomes an energy loop that only works if global prices remain high and European demand remains committed. If Europe pivots to nuclear expansion or cheaper American LNG, hydrogen subsidies fade. Egypt could be left holding billion-dollar infrastructure that does not pay back. This is the gamble within the gamble. Now, let's shift from energy to logistics, because no industrial vision survives without roads, ports, and movement. For decades, the Sinai Peninsula, where much of the SE zone sits, was effectively isolated from mainland Egypt. To move goods across the Suez Canal, trucks relied on ferries. Ferries that could take hours, sometimes days. Picture a line of cargo trucks baking in desert heat, waiting to cross a few hundred meters of water. That bottleneck alone could suffocate an economy before it began. So Egypt did something massive. It dug under the canal, the Ismailia tunnels. The port said tunnels. Multi-lane arteries beneath the water. Crossing times dropped from hours to minutes. This wasn't cosmetic infrastructure, it was existential. It connected the industrial east to the consumer west. It meant factories in the zone were no longer stranded outposts. They were plugged into the national grid, but solving physical bottlenecks exposed a digital one. Egypt introduced a centralized digital customs system, a single-window platform designed to streamline import and export documentation. In theory, it eliminated the need for physical paperwork and the informal payments that often accompanied it. In practice, the rollout was chaotic. Systems crashed. Exporters abroad struggled to adapt. Containers sat idle because a PDF was uploaded incorrectly. Over time, the system stabilized. Processing times improved. But compared to hyper-efficient hubs like Singapore or Rotterdam, Egypt still has a gap to close. To compensate, Cairo leaned on foreign operators. DP World from Dubai expanded port management operations. Hutchison Ports from Hong Kong invested in semi-automated terminals. Robotics replaced discretion. Automation replaces negotiation, because when you digitize customs, you reduce friction. And friction is the enemy of capital. Now we reach the heart of the matter. The Egyptian pound. Look at a decade-long chart of the EGP versus the US dollar, and you see a pattern that is difficult to ignore. Devaluation, repricing, step downward. Egypt imports most of its essentials: wheat, fuel, pharmaceuticals, electronics. Imports require dollars, but Egypt earns pounds. That imbalance creates what economists call a dollar trap. When global shocks hit, pandemics, wars, capital flight, foreign investors pull dollars from emerging markets first. Central banks burn reserves to defend their currencies. Imports become harder to finance. Goods pile up in ports. Even with new tunnels and modern terminals, containers can sit idle if banks cannot wire payments. This is where the SE zone transforms from development project to financial strategy. It is designed to generate hard currency. Factories export goods and get paid in euros and dollars. Land inside the zone is sold to foreign investors, often priced directly in dollars. Hydrogen deals are denominated in foreign currency. The zone becomes a mechanism to pull capital into the Egyptian banking system. But here lies the danger. If the SC zone becomes a dollarized island, efficient, export-driven, modern while the broader Egyptian economy struggles with inflation and a depreciating currency, you risk creating a dual economy. Two Egypts, one plugged into global capital, one wrestling with domestic hardship. That gap widens too far. Economic tension can morph into social tension. And social tension in a country of 110 million people is not a theoretical risk. So the SC zone is not just a gamble on logistics. It is a hedge against collapse. Which brings us to the final question. Even if Egypt builds the factories, fuels the ships, connects the tunnels, and stabilizes the currency, is it alone in this race? Because deserts with coastlines and ambition are not unique to Egypt. Saudi Arabia is building futuristic industrial cities. Morocco has already built one of Africa's most efficient ports. And whispers of alternative canals, even if unrealistic, signal one truth. The world does not like single points of failure. In the final section, we confront the competition and the verdict. Is this zone too strategic to fail? Or is it racing against time? Let's zoom out. Because megaprojects never exist in isolation. They exist in ecosystems of rivals. And the SC zone is not alone in dreaming big. To the west, in Morocco, there is a port that quietly did what Egypt is trying to do without the drama. Tangier Med sits at the mouth of the Mediterranean, right at the Strait of Gibraltar. It is stable, efficient, politically calmer. By the mid-2020s, it handled over 10 million containers annually, becoming Africa's largest port complex. Morocco didn't need a revolution, or a currency float, or a debt crisis. It just built, and it built well. Tangier Med's pitch is simple. We are Europe adjacent, Africa connected, and geopolitically boring. Boring is powerful in logistics. Ships prefer predictability over spectacle. Then there is the sci-fi competitor. Across the Red Sea, Saudi Arabia is building NEOM, a $500 billion futuristic experiment in desert urbanism. Inside, it sits Oxagon, a planned floating industrial city meant to redefine manufacturing and green industry. As of 2026, much of it remains steel, cranes, and renderings. But Saudi Arabia has something Egypt does not. Infinite fiscal runway. Sovereign wealth that can subsidize inefficiency for years without blinking. The Saudi pitch to investors could not be clearer. We have money, we have cheap energy, we have speed. Come here. If Saudi Arabia executes its industrial vision, it could siphon capital away from Egypt like a vacuum pulling oxygen from a room. And then there are the whispers. The Ben Gurion Canal idea, a hypothetical Israeli alternative route bypassing Suez. Technically improbable, geologically expensive, politically explosive. But the fact that such ideas circulate at all reveals global anxiety. The world does not like choke points. And the Suez Canal is the ultimate choke point, which means Egypt lives in paradox. It is too strategic to ignore, too important to collapse, but not immune to competition. So what is the verdict? Let's examine the case for failure first. If instability continues in the Red Sea, if maritime security remains unpredictable, shipping companies will reroute around Africa. We saw this happen during recent disruptions. 10 extra days at sea is expensive, but unpredictability is worse. If the Egyptian pound continues to weaken dramatically, investors may hesitate. Capital does not like currency erosion. If bureaucracy creeps back into the zone despite reforms, the one-stop-shop promise evaporates. And if global trade growth stagnates or fractures into regional blocks, the expected volumes may never materialize. That is the failure path. Now the case for success. Look at a map. Egypt is the only country physically bridging Africa, Asia, and Europe with maritime access to both the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. It sits at the intersection of three major consumer blocks. It has a population of over 110 million, a labor force waiting for industrial employment. It has natural gas reserves. It has trade agreements granting tariff-free access to markets spanning billions of consumers. The canal expansion is complete. The tunnels are built. Factories are operational. Hydrogen pilots are live. Revenues inside the SC's zone are rising. This is no longer theoretical. It is in the fake it until you make it phase. But increasingly, it is actually making it. And here is the deeper truth. The world needs Egypt to succeed. Because if Egypt fails, if debt overwhelms it, if industrialization stalls, if unemployment surges, the alternative is not a neutral outcome. It is a destabilized Mediterranean state with 110 million people and strategic waterways. That scenario terrifies Europe. It worries Washington, it complicates Beijing. Which means the SC zone is not just an Egyptian gamble. It is a global insurance policy. When the Ever Given blocked the canal, the world panicked because supply chains froze. Now imagine if the canal's host economy froze. That is why investment continues. Why Gulf states provide financial backstops. Why China embeds itself. Why Europe signs hydrogen moose. The SC zone is a high-stakes poker game played on sand. China brings factories. Russia seeks sanctioned breathing room. Europe brings climate money. The Gulf brings liquidity. Egypt brings geography. And geography, unlike currency, does not devalue. The final philosophical question is simple. Is Egypt transforming from toll collector to industrial power, or merely renting out industrial plots to foreign powers while remaining financially fragile? The answer may be both. Modern economic zones are rarely pure success stories. They are negotiated spaces, half sovereign, half global. The next time you buy a household appliance, a tire, a chemical product, or fill up a ship with green fuel, check the label. If it says Made in Egypt, it may not simply represent a factory. It may represent a geopolitical calculation. A certificate of origin masking a supply chain reroute. A dollar wire transfer stabilizing a currency. A tunnel beneath a canal shortening a truck's wait time from days to minutes. Or a president betting national credibility on desert infrastructure. The Suez Canal was once called the eighth wonder of the world. The SC zone is trying to become the ninth, not by digging water, but by digging for economic leverage. History teaches us that choke points shape empires. In 1929, global trade contraction triggered cascading collapses. In 2008, financial interconnection amplified crisis. In 2025 and beyond, logistics hubs and industrial corridors will define resilience. Egypt is wagering that the future belongs to connectors, not landlords, not spectators, but platforms. The gamble is immense. The stakes are sovereign, and the stopwatch is still ticking. Tick, $19 million. Tick, another $19 million. The canal flows. The factories hum. The desert waits to see whether this was foresight or ambition outrunning arithmetic. Would you invest your life savings in a factory in Sinai? That is not just a comment section question. It is the central risk calculation of modern Egypt. And the answer will determine whether the Suez Canal Economic Zone becomes a footnote in development history or the industrial pivot point of the Middle East.